And now we're continuing to the next session. And I must say, the next session evolved from our first meeting, in which we really realized that the alternatives that are not necessarily magic, but the alternatives that are other cultures very prominent, that take, I think, at least 50% of the world, and there should be part of the conversation. And so we decided that in this meeting, where we deal with history, we'll have a session that is devoted to Buddhism, because our feeling after the first meeting that Buddhism gives you a completely different set of answers and problems to the idea of this duality that we're dealing with, and to the idea of active matter. So our first speaker is Fabio Rambelli, and it will follow with a talk by Wen-shing Chou, and then again we will have questions and answers. So Fabio, please.
Thank you all. I'm very grateful for the organizers, to be given a chance to be here today, and I'm also glad that Buddhism is part of the formal program. It's not like a token of exoticism, until recently it was treated, but it was considered, but it's like part of the conversation. And I do believe that you see, that's also my experience, that no matter how exotic and remote the objects are, if we sit on a table and we talk about things, we end up talking about pretty much the same things, but of course with different perspectives and different approaches very often. But I was stunned, this morning, to listening to the papers, how shared, the elements are across Eurasia for many centuries. So of course, all cultures come up with different ideas, but I think it's good to talk to each other. Now, my paper, partly, reading the program and listening to the papers today, I realized that partly overlaps with other topics. So it's not only about Buddhism, it's not only about history. It talks about magic, it talks about all kinds of other things. And I should also say that talking about a specific musical instrument, I mean, that kind of overflows outside of Buddhism, because it interacts with other religious traditions and with other contexts of practice that are not strictly Buddhist, but still, there's a strong component, strong importance of Buddhism in it, and I think it's important. Also because when we talk about objects, objects never belong, I think, to one specific object. Even if in the West, there was the Christian tradition, but Christianity did not inform 100% all the uses of any object. So I think that there's also another kind of point for comparison that might be useful to address. I should also say at the very beginning that this is a new project I've been working on. It's very recent. I mean, it's in progress, and I'm very excited about it. And there's a lot I would like to tell, and I will try to stick to the time limit. So please let me know when when it's getting close to the end. Just to frame my presentation a bit. Buddhism asks a fundamental question about the animated nature of things, namely, are things animated in themselves, or are they animated through interactions with humans? And when I talk about Buddhism, I talk about Japanese Buddhism, because that's the one I most I know a little more than the others, and within Japanese Buddhism itself, there is no definitive answer to the question that I just posed. Some people say, things get animated because, they interact with us. Others say, no, they're animated in themselves. I'm not sure myself which position to take on this, but I do believe that it's likely that at least being open to the possibility that objects might be animated makes it easier to either recognize animation, or at least to act as if this were the case. And recognizing, I will come back to this in the conclusion if there is time, but recognizing the animation of the objects, I mean, I'm not advocating any particular kind of new age or magic thinking here. I just think that being aware of the importance that objects have for us and for what we do probably changes the attitudes that we have with objects and with the environment in general. But let's okay, let's start. So along these lines, if we are open to the idea that by interacting with objects, we change. I mean, the objects change, but we also change because we create a kind of symbiosis. Today, I'll begin to explore how animation of a specific object, this particular instrument here, results from multiple factors. And those can be ideas, can be philosophical, like metaphysical ideas, can be actions, rituals, can be accident, things just happen that way and ended up in having certain consequences. But what I'm trying to say is that animation, whatever we think about it, but the animation of objects in specific cultures is not only based on one thing, on one factor, but it's a combination of different factors that are, can be pretty broad. So let me see. I also notice whenever I go to conferences about materiality, about objects, very few people talk about musical instruments. So I decided to bring it up today and see what kind of reactions I get. Okay, so this is what I'm trying to do today. So I will have to tell you something about the Chou, this kind of elusive musical instrument, and a few words about how agency of musical instruments has been understood recently, and how that is related also to the extension of the human body mind. I mean, that's what these musical instruments do, in a way. And then, so these are all factors that can combine in giving the instrument a particular status among the objects. And then I will say a few things about metaphysics of the Chou, about sacred aspects of the instruments in their historical contexts. One aspect that comes up in medieval sources in Japan is that the Chou was used as kind of regalia, symbol of the imperial power and the power of the shogun, the military authority that was ruling Japan at the time. And then a few final general considerations. Okay, so let me begin with the Chou. I'm going to show a picture in a moment. It's a Actually, let me show a picture immediately now. So this is the instrument. As you can see at the center, what's it here? Can I point to the? Oh, it's easier to work. Okay, so this is the instrument like this. It's about 53 centimeters, so something like that. This is the detail of the bottom part. This is the mouthpiece. You can either blow or so inhale or exhale air from here. These are the pipes, the reeds. You close it with the fingers, and by closing it, the instrument, the pipe makes a sound. There are reeds that are not visible inside around here. And as you can see, it's a beautiful object. The bamboo pipes are selected because of their shape, and some of the rough parts are also appreciated aesthetically. This instrument in particular is beautifully decorated. This is an old one. It's beautifully decorated. Here, the accessories are made with silver. This is made with sakura cherry tree. It's carved inside and lacquered on the outside. What else? Yeah, so it has 17 pipes, and only 15 are used in classical Japanese music. In contemporary music, they added the reeds to the 2 additional pipes, so they can make 17 sounds. It's an ancient mouth organ, similar to the harmonica, let's say, although it works in a different way because there are vibrating reeds inside. It's ancient because the first instruments that I know of were discovered in tomb excavations in China dating from 25 centuries ago. And then it became an instrument of the imperial court music in China, and it was exported to Japan around the 600, 700s. It is also very widely spread in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, where is a family of, a variant of this instrument, part of the same family. I call it a relic from ancient Japan because from the documents that I've seen, the instrument, as it is still used today, it's basically the same as it was described in manuals from the 1200s, and probably older than that. So there's been no technological innovation whatsoever. The materials are the same, the procedures are the same. And coming from Japan, where technological advancement is one of the main aspects of their culture, this is kind of interesting. They decided to preserve it the way as it was 1,800 or 800 or 1,000 years ago, if not longer than that. Now the repertory. Again, I called it an elusive instrument because in Japan, most Japanese have never seen it from close by, and many of them have never listened to the music, especially the solo repertoire. So it is used only in one genre among the court music of Japan, the music for the emperor. They still have an orchestra there, affiliated with the Imperial Household Agency, so it's kind of an official institution. And it's called, the genre is called Togaku, which literally means music from Tang China. So again, we're talking about music imported in Japan in 700, 800s, 900s, and elaborated upon. It includes music originally from China, from India, and from Southeast Asia. And again, they still play it. Other genres of court music don't employ the show anymore. What is interesting to me is that, because that is also related, I think, somehow to conversation that we are having about conversation here, conservation. It's that it is being revived in contemporary music since the late 70s, early 80s. Several Japanese famous composers have written for show solo, and also Western musicians. I mean, John Cage is the first person that comes to mind. He wrote 3 pieces for the instrument. And so there's been this kind of revival of interest in this particular instrument in ways that are not classical, they're not traditional. So the instrument has become something else from what it was and what it was to be. Now, in terms of techniques, I would say that there are 3 basic techniques. One is the solo instrumental music in the classical repertoire, and those are kind of modal preludes. There are 6 modes. I mean, I don't want to get into that, but solo preludes that last from 12 to 25 minutes each, depending on the mode. It's kind of a Indian raga kind of thing. Most of the time, the instrument is used for kind of chordal accompaniments. So it plays the harmony for the other instruments playing the melody. There are 12 of those classical chords, which are basically clusters of sounds. And then in contemporary, and the techniques for the solo music and the chordal accompaniment are quite different. And in contemporary music, of course, they exploit all kinds of new techniques that are not part of the classical way of doing it. In terms of musicians, of course, now there are several musicians in Japan and also abroad playing the instrument, but the tradition is based on one single family, the Toyohara house, which today is called Bunno family, and they are affiliated with the Imperial Household Agency. It's a family that dates back, well, they say to the 600s. Probably not true, but certainly around the 11th century, they are mentioned at court playing this instrument and teaching the instrument to many other people at court and outside, like at temples and so forth. So again, it's kind of a unique phenomenon because there's one family, extended of course, with the branches and ramifications that have been in charge of this instrument and the repertoire and the aesthetics related to it for about 1,000 years. So, like I said, these are the pictures. Okay, this is me with the instrument. This is how you play it. It's very close. Something that is kind of interesting that you don't see your fingers, so you don't know what you're doing. That is an added difficulty when playing the instrument. When you play a saxophone, you can see yourself, right? Whereas here, you have no idea what you are hitting. Breathing is very important because whatever you do, you're not expected to stop anytime. So you have to breathe in and out continuously for like half an hour, and it can be really kind of vexing. It's a kind of meditation when you play it, if you think about it, because you really have to control the breath. There are notes of different length, so it's not a regular rhythm. Some are shorter, some are longer, some are very long, and so you have to dose the breath according to the length of the music that you're playing. Here I have like a bonus. Okay, how do I do this? I'm supposed to. Okay, sorry. How do I, maybe with this? Just to give you an idea of the sound. The quality is not very good, but so it goes in another file and I play it here. Okay, well. Not now, okay. No. Oh, sorry. Okay, so this was a fragment of a modal prelude for the spring mode. Uh, as you see, there isn't much action. In fact, one of the key aesthetic things of this instrument is that you don't have to move. So the least you move, the better it is. So I'm still doing this. That's bad. But the finger movement, is very hard to detect, and that's again part of the this is a very dignified music genre, played for the emperor, for the highest aristocrats, throughout the ages. So excessive manifestations of again bodily manifestations were kind of not appreciated, let's say. So on the agencies of the instrument, coming to the topic for today, several years ago, I encountered this citation from Bruno Latour's, I think it's a subtitle of one of his chapters, Objects Do Have Agency. And then he describes it in many different ways. But, I was thinking, okay, how about musical instruments? Don't they have like a special kind of agency? Finally, I found these citations from Kevin Daw, who's written a beautiful book on the agency of the guitar. And he says that Daw points to the peculiarity of musical instruments precisely because that consists in the multisensorial dimensionality that goes beyond the sensoriality of other objects. They make sounds, you make sounds through them, they are beautifully shaped, they have all kinds of things that add to their dimension. Now music is also, there was a question today about music and language and how that plays with magic. I mean that's a completely different dimension in culture that goes beyond the specific use of specific objects, right? So that provides a challenge to the senses as an extension of both the human body and the human mind. And so this was kind of the starting point for what I'm trying to do today. Now, in terms of extensions, many years ago, Umberto Eco wrote a typology of what he calls prostheses, extensions of the body. He calls, and those are tools, instruments, technological innovations that extend the capabilities of the body, and they make something else, something that the body isn't able to do. Now, musical instruments are precisely that, right? I mean, a flute can make sounds that the voice cannot reproduce, and in a wider range. The show here, makes like 15 or 17 sounds, and well, the most you can play is probably 8 or 9 at a time. But that's impossible to do for a human being. Now, Eco focuses on the extensions of the body, but following Daw, I think that musical instruments in particular, are also extensions of the mind as well, right? Because by here I talk about the show, but probably any musical instrument is like that. There's a symbiosis that is being created by the instrument and the performer that involves all kinds of things. So it's not only the body that how you sit, the posture, the breathing, the fingerings, and so forth. But the production of the instrument. Sometimes it is the performers themselves who are supposed to make the instruments. The personalization that happens. In the case of the show, musicians like to use the sweat for the face, for example. So they do this with the instrument, and by adding the moisture from the body and the hands and the face, the color of the pipes of the bamboo changes, and that is highly appreciated. And the idea is that you are giving some of the instrument, some of yourself to the instrument. You're not only taking the instrument to yourself to play, but you're also putting something of yourself from your body inside the instrument. And so this aspect of personalization, it's really important and is explicit. Maintenance also, right? That musicians are supposed to do it themselves. The performance and their composition. Now, performance and composition are also something that concern the mind, right? Because the instrument has limitations. So you have to think about how to use the limitations to make something different, or how to overcome the limitations that come with the physics of the instrument to make. So it's both an extension of the body and the mind, and I think that makes things easier to be seen as being animated, because there is a kind of mental, personal component that gets attached to it. I should also talk about the overall importance of ritualization when using this particular instrument. The very first lesson that I took of this was about how to open the bag that contains the instrument, how to take the instrument out, how to fold the bag. It's a little silk bag, and how to fold it, how to hold the instrument, and how to put it back. So that was the first class. So there is all this kind of dimension that is not necessarily relevant for how you play, but is certainly part of the context in which the object is used. So it makes it special, right? The fact that it's surrounded by all these rituals about handling. Now, to add another layer to what I said, the several factors that involve an attribution of agency. I think that metaphysics is important. Again, this comes from a very different culture. In China and in Japan, the traditional ontology or cosmology has been called correlative, because there are a series of 5 elements, and earth, fire, water, metal, and wood. And everything in the world, everything that exists, is based on these 5 elements. And these 5 elements circulate among each other. So one generates the other, and one overcomes or destroys the other. So that's why everything needs to be kept in balance. And these 5 broad, large elements are also seen in different levels of reality. For example, we have the 5 elements I mentioned that are out there. Those are reflected into the 5 organs inside the body. They are reflected into the 5 stars, the constellations. The planets. They are reflected in the interfaces between the body inside and the outside, so the senses, sight, touch, and so forth. 5 directions, 5 seasons, and all of the 5 notes, the 5 sounds. So an instrument like that is part of this cosmology. Now, the 5 elements are really important for the show, because the show is made with wood, bamboo, and metal, the reeds. And fire and water are very important for the performance. The instrument needs to be warmed up before, during, and after the performance. It's a pain, because you have to warm it up 15 minutes before you play, and 15 minutes after and during. And the reason is that the breath carries water in it, and condensation is bad for the instrument, because if the condensation sticks to the very thin reeds that it has, the reed won't play. So you need to warm it up continuously to make it evaporate. So the balance of water and fire, yin and yang, is really central for the instrument. If you warm it too much, then you're going to damage the instrument. If you don't warm it enough, then there will be too much condensation, and therefore you won't play. So it's like one of these, Zen riddles, that you have really to keep a balance there. And air is, of course, crucial too, because you need it, for playing, and the control over breath is essential, as I just said. And breathing is, by definition, yin and yang. Out breathing and in breathing represents or describes the circulation of yin and yang from the outside world into the inside of the body. and the instrument becomes a microcosm in this way, right? It's really a condensation of the 5 elements. It's a condensation of the yin and yang, and it's also part of the 8 materials of music that constitute the instruments in classical orchestras in China and Japan. Instruments made with metal, made with wood, made with skin, with all kinds of things. So these are, but there are 8 substances that are traditionally used. So again, we don't have to know any of this, but I think that if you belong to a culture where, and the musicians were aware of that, the way you use the instrument, the way you see the instrument is really different from somebody who doesn't know anything about this. The instrument is really a condensation of all the forces that are operating in the universe. A further dimension that enhances agency, or that might enhance agency, are the secret aspects that are involved in the instrument itself, in its music and its performance. Let me begin with the origin narratives, and these are reported in very ancient Chinese texts. The instrument was attributed to a primordial goddess in Chinese mythology called Nuhua. And this primordial deity descends on earth and settles down the forces of chaos and is the beginning of civilization. Then she will be followed by the sage emperors who set out the rules for human society. And that is the beginning of civilization as we know it. So this is before the beginning of civilization, where again nature is still in a situation of chaos and she settles it down. So this goddess one day sees on the beach 17 phoenixes. The phoenix is one of the mythological animals in Chinese and East Asian mythology. So he sees 17 of them, and they're all singing in different sounds. So she says, okay, I want to make an instrument that reproduces that. So she goes to a sacred mountain, which is still a sacred mountain for Taoism, Mount Kunlun. And in the northern valley of the mountain, she finds these special reeds, pipes. So she makes an instrument with the 17 reeds that reproduces both the shape of the phoenix. It's not clear from the image that I showed you, but in all the instruments there was a bocal coming out of it, and if you look at it from the side, it looks like a phoenix with the wings up and the mouth and the beak in this direction. So the instrument is a copy, an iconic sign, a copy of both the shape of the phoenix and the sounds of the phoenix, and it was done at the time in which phoenixes were still around in the world. They're no longer here with us, they're invisible, by a goddess. So, that brings us to point 2. The show is a double, is a sample, is an indexical icon of sacred entities, right? The shape, the sound, and the materials, they come from a sacred mountain, not from any particular reed. But this is the first one, right? And I suspect that most instruments in this particular genre of music have similar mythical narratives. Like the flute, for example, is an instrument that reproduces the sound of dragons in the sea. The hichiriki, which is a kind of oboe, is the sound of the Kalavinka mythical bird in the Buddhist paradise. So with all these kind of mythical animals their sounds are being reproduced in instruments. But here I would like to emphasize the indexical icon aspect of the instrument and its music. It's really a copy. I mean, this copy is the same thing as a double of this original experience that the goddess had millennia ago. Then later, we find religious associations with Taoism, with Buddhism, in Japan with Shinto. We find in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries the development of secret music pieces called hikyoku that were transmitted in special rituals involving the Buddhist goddess of music, which again adds to this kind of sacred dimension. And I think that the fifth point is also relevant because this is a musical. These instruments are used in performances that are, in many ways, extraordinary. This is not the regular music that you listen, while you commute on the subway, for example, or These are imperial ceremonies. Even today, there are religious rituals, or Buddhist temples, or Shinto shrines. And in the past, not today, as far as I know, they were used as propitiation before battles. For example, the shogun was playing the show, or had somebody playing the show to kind of pacify, calm his mind, and they were using a special show that I will tell you in a moment. So here we can probably find how the combination of metaphysics, what I described before, with all these layers of sacrality might conjure, some particular forces, being attributed to this particular object. And which leads me to the next point, that the show was used as a regalia for the emperor and for the samurai, for the shogun in particular. Now, the traditional regalia of the Japanese emperors are three, and they don't include musical instruments, but we know from documents that the instruments were almost equally important as symbols of legitimization, a symbol of power. The idea was that if you play an instrument well, that those particular instruments used at court, you are able to harness the sounds of the cosmos, and if you put the sounds of the cosmos in harmony, then the cosmos and the realm will be also in harmony. That is part of the metaphysics that I described before. Now, at some point, the shoguns in the mid 1300s, they appropriate the show and they make it their own symbol, the symbol of their own lineages. And in particular, dachimon, which is an instrument. Important instruments have names. They're given names, pretty much like human beings. The show dachimon is used in many important ceremonies for the shogun in the 13 and 1400s. And it was used together with a harmor that belonged to the ancestor of the family of the shogun. So the harmor, the military power, and the show, the symbol of harmonization power, are used together in these particular rituals. And this set of associations, occur at a time in what is medieval Japan between the 12th and the 16th centuries, in which regalia were, so objects of power associated with authority, were combined or associated with magical jewels. We heard a lot about gems today. There is an extensive discourse in Buddhism about magical, wish-fulfilling jewels and gems. And they were connected to relics of the Buddha, and in this particular case, to musical instruments. So you can see a continuity. An instrument is certainly a relic of past masters because of the body, contact with them. It is a regalia. It has some kind of magical power, which comes from its sacredness and its metaphysical structure. Now, I should also say that all of this pretty much disappears in the 1600s. Pretty much disappears. So after the 1600s, the show is used in court music as purely ceremonial music, with very little sacred or metaphysical associations. The problem, though, is that, and I go into the final considerations. So how do we study the history of this instrument? What do we see in it? Again, because if you only look at an instrument, it never changed. But that doesn't mean that it hasn't changed for 1,000 years. It doesn't mean that there was no breaks or no changes in its history. And here I like this quote by Caroline Bynum, that objects have their own narratives, right? So there is a continuity in form, but there are a lot of changes in terms of content and signification that the instrument had. Several levels, several types of resignifications, which are listed here. Now, today, the show is an example of cultural heritage, and this is emphasized. If you check the website of the Imperial Household of Japan, they emphasize the fact that what they do at court is nothing like imperialistic or militaristic, like the associations that we have during the war. They are preserving all kinds of Asian, not only Japanese, Asian cultural heritage, and they keep the tradition alive. So that's how they justify their existence. At the same time, this revival of interest for these traditional forms has created an additional interest in music, this particular music, for new musical possibilities. So that's why, you know, contemporary composers, even Björk, you know, the rock singer from Iceland, used the show in one of the recent CDs productions. So going back to the Buddhist context, you know, beyond Oriental exoticism, right? I think we're well beyond that stage in most cases. I think that Buddhism can help us questioning a simple dichotomy of animate and inanimate, precisely because, you know, of the ways in which they have explored the possibilities. It brings back to the need for, it was mentioned today also, you know, ethno-ontologies, right? You know, how different cultures, which can be time and space specific, but how they describe their own ontologies. It can also be the opposite, right? Onto-ethnologies, right? Like field work in different ontological systems. Now, in contemporary Japan, I mean, there is an extensive discourse about spirits, agencies in objects, which is not really traditional. It's kind of a new, it's kind of innovation. But still, it is related to all kinds of things that are going on here in terms of thinking about objects in a different way. And in some of my work on the materiality of Buddhism, for example, I've been playing with the idea that perhaps this enhanced awareness of the objects and what they do to us might be a way to overcome or circumvent, you know, what Marx called the labor alienation. You know, the fact that in many places, you know, we do things without having any control on what we do, but being aware of what the object and the instrument in this case does to you, and what you can do through the instrument and what you couldn't do without it, kind of gives you a different sense of what you're doing and your presence in this world. I don't know if this can be called re-enchantment. I guess in some cases it goes that far, in other cases it's just an enhanced awareness. But okay, I think I'll stop here. It is probably my time has come. But thank you so much for your attention, and I'm looking forward to the conversation later.
No, it's great. And our next speaker, Wen-shing Chou, please.
Thank you so much, Professors Miller and Weinryb, for inviting me to this wonderful conference and wonderful project. I just want to start out by saying that because we're dealing so much with, I think, the questions of conceptual categories here, and because objects themselves don't speak in that language, and when we're dealing with objects made in the Buddhist context, I don't believe we have yet developed a very good vocabulary, in English at least, to talk about them. And so I would like to contribute my perspective, but also ask you to take me to task, or at least question my use of these terms, such as matter, agency, and so on. So this tanka, a Tibetan-style hanging scroll, now in the Freer Gallery of Art, was among at least 7 tankas that were made in the 18th century Qing court in China. And once they were displayed in the major monasteries in Beijing, in Inner Mongolia, and Tibet. At the center of this tanka is the Tianlong Emperor, the 18th century ruler who appears in several compounded guises as an ordained monk, as evident in his layered monk's robe, a manifestation of the Buddhist deity of wisdom, Manjushri. I'm going to repeat the name, so please remember Manjushri. And you can see that through the ways in which you can see that there's a sword here above one shoulder, there's a book here above his other shoulder, which are attributes of the deity Manjushri. Sword as a kind of the sword that cuts through appearance, in the book of wisdom. And and then also as a Chakravartin, which is originally a Buddhist, an Indian ideal, which later adopted by Indian Buddhists and also Buddhists elsewhere, of a universal or enlightened ruler who turns the wheel of law and whose reign brings peace and justice. So holding this wheel, he's then being represented as a Chakravartin, a wheel-turning king. In order to present him as the ultimate Buddhist king, right, these many layers, Qianlong enlists the help of none other than his favorite court painter, the Milanese Jesuit brother Giuseppe Castiglione, who rendered precise features of Qianlong's face in a suppressed chiaroscuro, a shadowless modeling technique that Castiglione developed to meet the preference of his royal patron. The physiognomic realism in Qianlong's face contrasts sharply with the rest of the composition, which were painted by Tibetan Buddhist monk painters of the Qing court, who would have been familiar with the larger system of ritual to which this artistic production belonged. Tantric deities, adepts, teachers, and protectors grouped into different series and assemblies floats across a vibrantly colored landscape that evokes the residential abode of Manjushri in Mount Wutai, northern China. This painting forces our attention, in the words of art historian Patricia Berger, and I quote here, by arraying the dazzling stuff of visions around the strikingly materialized imperial face, end of quote. The reign of the Qianlong Emperor spanned most of the 18th century. He was the fourth Manchu ruler to rule from China proper. The Manchus were, as a semi-nomadic people who conquered China from the north side of the Great Wall and who established what became known as the Qing dynasty. Throughout their almost 300 years of reign, the Manchus crafted and maintained an ethnic identity that was distinct from the people they ruled. Yet they also they were the Chinese, right? Yet they also completely adopted Chinese notions of dynastic governance through rituals, policies, bureaucratic systems, and cultural production. Here is a map. It was under Qianlong Emperor that the Qing reached its greatest territorial extent and the height of its power and prosperity. In fact, this is the reason why much of current People's Republic of China claims the territories that they do is owing to the work of Qianlong. He famously had himself portrayed in a range of guises, as a Manchu horseman, as an 18th century antiquarian, or as a Confucian literati, thus enacting multiple established ideals of kingship. As scholars of Qing history have shown, the Manchu rulers' statecraft depended heavily on a retelling of their origins and identity, as well as those of the peoples to whom they sought to rule. Historian Johann Overskov described their efforts to project themselves as, and I quote, the ultimate apotheosis of righteous rulers in the recurring cycles of history and myth, end of quote. So seen in this context, the Tanka fashions Qianlong as a divine Buddhist ruler to his inner Asian Buddhist constituents in Beijing, in Mongolia, and Tibet. We know that at least one Tanka was presented to the 8th Dalai Lama upon his enthronement in the Potala Palace in Tibet, and that it was reportedly well received. So that Qianlong himself was a serious practitioner of Tibetan Buddhism, and who oversaw the building of a series of Tibetan Buddhist temples and monastic institutions in and around the capital, only helped scholars to identify various parts of the composition in connections with the particular ritual initiations he undertook, thus more firmly establishing the Tanka as a map of the emperor's spiritual lineage. But what hasn't been discussed is the object ambiguous ontological status. And so thanks to this conference, we get to talk about that. So how did this image created in the Qing court through the joint effort of the Jesuit and Tibetan Buddhist monks painters operate within the ritual context of Tibetan Buddhism? Where images performed very important ritual functions, right? What status did the particular portrayal confer upon the emperor? In what ways was the image effective or efficacious to its intended audience? My presentation today will focus on extant tankas, seen here, as well as multimedia shrine panels that all portray the emperor as a deity incarnate. There are several, you can see here, I just lay out here several other tankas. There are various different compositions, but they all more or less consist of similar cast of gods and spiritual masters who are set into this kind of periodicical landscape. I would like to bring attention to this group and potentially a much larger set of objects, of iconic objects from the Qing court, that seems to confound any fixed model of ritual and therefore ontology, due to the fact that they borrowed from the ritual lexicon of Tibetan Buddhism without any clear evidence of legitimately belonging to that context, devotional context. So, in other words, I think these images they must have seemed very shocking to the average Tibetan at the time. So then this leads me to then the question I have for you is that if their ontological status is suspect or at best hybrid, what are the implications for their conservation, restoration, and display? The composition of the Qianlong tankas, and I'll be referring to them as the Qianlong tankas, they bear the closest resemblance to a genre of Tibetan Buddhist objects called refuge field. You can see that on the right, and this painting on the right from the Rijksmuseum. These refuge field paintings pictorialize the so-called refuge field, which I think really roughly translate, we're talking about field is in field of merits in Buddhism. In Buddhism, the idea of to accumulate merits, the field of merits that are generated by this collection of teachers, right? So these paintings pictorialize the refuge fields that were used for the ritual venerations of teachers in Tibetan Buddhism. This tanka on the left is probably an earlier version, one of the 7 that I just showed you. You can see from these two comparisons the compositional affinities between the Qianlong tankas and the refuge field tankas that were, the one on the right comes from Tibet. Here, the central figure seated atop a great tree is Tsongkhapa, the 14th century founder of the Gelug school of Tibetan Buddhism. The Gelugpa school later became the sect that the Dalai Lamas, the Panchen Lamas, belonged to, and they were also the sect that the Qing emperors aligned themselves with. So the Qianlong, the kind of the Tibetan Buddhism he practiced was sort of belonging to this sect, generally speaking. The teachers preceding Tsongkhapa preceding the central figure of Tsongkhapa are ranged in the sky above him, and the various deities of the Gelugpa tradition surrounds him. So he's seen as the sort of genesis of this teaching. The painting is in turn based on a 17th century liturgical text. The short name for the text is Guru Puja in Sanskrit. That still is used today, and it serves as a preliminary ritual devotion to one's guru at the beginning of any tantric meditation practice. So only those who have received so-called empowerments are allowed to practice this. As part of this ritual, the practitioner engaged in a visualization, which I will very quickly summarize what that is in this context. It's a rigorous psychosomatic exercise in imagining the spiritual teachers in very vivid detail, generating their idealized universe, the environment, and then inviting the deities to come to that place. So first imagining them and then inviting them to actually come to the imagined world. And then eventually to have that world dissolve into the central teacher, and then to have that world eventually come into the practitioner's heart through the crown of her head before all that is generated, visualized and produced and invited, then gets dissolved. The aim of visualization practice in general, any kind of visualization practice, is to deconstruct perceived notions of reality, and in doing so transform the practitioner and reality itself. So in other words, the training is to create a more perfect version of reality in order to perceive that the fact that all realities are illusory, impermanent. According to this particular text, Guru Puja, the practitioner is instructed to visualize the teacher and deities dissolving into the central guru in the image of Tsongkhapa, who then is absorbed into the image of the guru atop one's head, and then, quote, to the anthers of the lotus of one's heart, end of quote. This visualization practice can be understood as a technology that allows the practitioner to have this very extraordinary blessing from and devotion to one's own teacher. I put in just to, these are really overwhelming objects, so I'm just fill up a little bit, something from a different context. But I wanted to, so this notion of kind of fusing one's teacher with one's body is a kind of very interesting notion that can trace back to the Indian context. It reminded me of the end of the Indian epic Ramayana, when Hanuman tears open his chest to reveal an image of Rama and Sita. And this is a sign to show his genuine devotion. So I won't go too far now into the technologies, the technicalities of this visualization practice, but I want to focus instead on the relationship between the physical tanka that you see here and the psychosomatic practice itself. So the tankas, in fact, frequently serve as a visual and material template for what a practitioner is instructed to generate in a meditative visualization. So, for example, I'll read the translation of a Guru Puja text, a part of it that begins to ask the practitioner to visualize this devotion. And you can look at this, kind of think about the relationship between that prescription, that textual prescription for visualization versus what was made into a tanka. And I quote here: "In the vast heavens of indivisible voidness and bliss, amidst bellowing clouds of Samantabhadra offerings, embellished with leaves, flowers, and fruit, is a wish-granting tree. At its crest, on a lion throne ablaze with precious gems, on a lotus, a sun, and a full moon disk, sits my root guru, kind in three ways. You are the essence of all the Buddhas. You have the aspect of a saffron-robed monk, with one face, two arms, and a radiant white smile. Your right hand expresses teaching, your left in meditative pose, holds a begging bowl filled with nectar, are draped in three robes of lustrous saffron, and your head is graced by a pandita's gold-colored hat." And then it goes on and on and on. And further down, "Adorned with the major and minor marks, you radiate 1,000 light rays. As, enhaloed by a 5-colored rainbow, you sit in a Vajra position. Your purified skandhas are the 5 meditational Buddhas. Your 4 elements are the 4 consorts. Your sense spheres, veins, sinews, and members are all in reality bodhisattvas. The hairs of your pores are the 21,000 arhats. Limbs are wrathful deities. Light-rayed hide directional guardians and yakshas, while all worldly deities are cushions for your feet. Surrounding you, and in their proper order, actual and lineage gurus, tutelary deities, hosts of mandala deities, Buddhas, protectors, bodhisattvas, bodhisattvas, daikas, dakinis, and protectors from an encircling sea." End of quote. These descriptions make clear that the practitioner's visualized refuge field is a 3-dimensional world, and that a tanka too also suggests that 3-dimensionality. Moreover, when this visualized world is pictorialized and materialized in the tanka serves, in the word of the Tibetologist Roger Jackson, as, I quote, "both a map of the Tibetan sacred cosmos and an index of the guru's crucial role in the tradition as a mediator between the practitioner on the one hand and the diachronic lineage of teachers and synchronic pantheon of deities on the other." End of quote. It is, in other words, a reminder of one's spiritual genealogy, in which Tsongkhapa is regarded as the source of all teachings. In a woodblock print that was the basis of the Ruben tanka you see on the left. This is a frequent practice. They would have, at some point, the codification in a form of woodblock prints that then tankas were then made on the basis of. And you can see that in this woodblock print, there's a colophon in the box below that clearly spells out the aims of creating this, quote, pictorial body, unquote, to aid the deity yoga, which is the visualization practice. Okay, so returning now to the Qianlong tankas, if the image of Tsongkhapa is now replaced by that of the Qing emperor in the Qianlong tankas, and if the tanka is assumed to carry the same function as a pictorial support, it would imply that Qianlong is now the envisioned guru of this new refuge field. Now, we know quite a lot about Qianlong's own teacher, his own guru, the brilliant Mongol polymath Zhangjia Ropei Dorje, who was also the Qing state preceptor and a chief translator, iconographer, architect, and diplomatic liaison for all things Buddhist and Inner Asian. But to read the Qianlong Tanka as evidence that the emperor was himself visualized as a guru by others, and that these tankas were in fact used for the ritual veneration of him, would be to undermine the playfulness with which Qianlong and his court appropriated objects, images, rituals, and identities. In another version of the Qianlong Tanka, the wish-granting tree appears above Qianlong, thus possibly suggesting that Qianlong, as an emanation of the deity Manjushri, is portrayed as performing devotion to his guru. You can see that. You see that the tree that appears above the crown of his head. This very well. That the tanka acts as a sort of proof of Qianlong's devotions, and that he, the subject rather than the object of visualization, is the focal point of the composition, would have bewildered anyone who was familiar with the visualization practice. However, it is unclear just how familiar viewers in the mid-18th century, when this tanka presumably date to, would have been with the genre of refuge field tankas. While liturgical texts of the refuge field tankas date to the 17th century, the earliest extant refuge field paintings date to the mid-18th century, at around the same time the Qianlong tankas were produced, which complicates a very straightforward narrative of derivation. Rather, it seems most likely that just as the image of refuge field was being codified into their pictorial and material form to render a new cosmological representation, the Qing seized the opportunity to insert the emperor's image into this almost formed form of ineffable vision. The verse inscriptions that appears below all of these tankas, below the throne in the Qianlong tankas, emphasizes the interplay of these various identities and subjectivities. It employs a series of puns and wordplays to infer Qianlong's sort of variously emanation or connections to Manjushri, to Tsongkhapa, to his teacher Zhangjia, and then also to the 8th Dalai Lama himself. So I won't go through, but basically it's these word puns that are being enacted to kind of simultaneously layer on more identities. It also references the longevity rites that Zhangjia conducted on Qianlong's behalf. In the same way that so many entities are simultaneously folded into one prayer verse, the composition can also be seen as a hybrid, a composite of plethora of pictorial conventions, among which Guru Puja refuge paintings is only one. I won't go into the details of the various conventions, but we can talk about that if relevant to the discussion later. An 8th tanka, shown on the left, that looks remarkably similar to the several compositions of Qianlong tanka, and on an example which is seen on the right. So on the right is one from the 7 that I just showed you. On the left is an 8th one. Okay, it's very similar, as you can see, or at least on the surface of it. It's in present scholarship, it's either being met with complete silence or just false identification of him as Qianlong. The central figure is in fact none other than Qianlong's own guru, Zhangjia, who is recognizable by the characteristic lump on his right cheek. Just in case you can see, he has a kind of lump on his right cheek, and this is another portrait of him that we know has that. So we know this is him. And while both figures are wearing scholar's hat, monastic robes, both are seated on a 3-cushion throne, displaying the same gesture, there's no ambiguity concerning the central figures. Qianlong holds a jeweled wheel of law of the Chakravartin, while Zhangjia holds a long live vase. The Lama is recognizable through the iconographic attributes of Bel and Bhadra, see here, and his personal meditation deity, Chakrasambhara, in the position of his root Lama, which is directly above, right above. which is Zhang Jia himself in the Qianlong painting on the right. So that person is this person. That person up above is this person here. Is replaced here by Tsongkhapa and his two chief disciples. There's also a slight reconfiguration of the figures. They have to be shuffled around a little bit to account for these differences. And we have two new figures who are inserted here. So this eighth tanka complicates an already fraught image-making practice. On the one hand, since Zhang Jia was Qianlong's beloved guru, his beloved guru, the tanka, like seven others portraying Qianlong, likely could and probably did operate within a Tibetan devotional context, and that it could have served as a support for the meditational visualization of Zhang Jia for his disciples, including and especially for the emperor disciple Qianlong. On the other hand, the affinity between Zhang Jia and Qianlong tankas was also extremely bold. That Zhang Jia is represented by Qing court artists as an emanation of Manjushri that is nearly identical to that of an emperor, and presiding over the same universe as the emperor, elevates his status to a place that was never otherwise accorded to any subject of the emperor, not even the emperor's own guru. In either scenario, the existence of Zhang Jia's tanka seems to bridge an ontological gap between the refuge field tankas and the Qianlong tankas. In the former, by producing a plausible object to be used within the devotional context of Tibetan Buddhism, and in the latter, by capitalizing on the fluid and interchangeable identities of teachers and disciples between spiritual and worldly aims of the devotional practice. Yet another group of objects in a different medium experiments with this translation of the visionary or imaginative into form. A sandalwood encased shrine panel portrays a similar Qianlong as Manjushri composition, flanked by Qianlong's calligraphic couplets on either sides, praises the central image. The panel adorn panels like this adorn the walls and memorial halls. This one was adorn the walls of a memorial hall dedicated to Qianlong's guru, Zhang Jia, inside the Tibetan Buddhist compound of the Forbidden Palace. Oh, okay. In the center of the panel is a nine-niched palace that enshrines a golden image of the Gelugpa monk, robed in its golden image of the monk in relief, set into a lush blue and green landscape under the sky of multicolored clouds. The panel contains 107 glass-covered niches. In the recess of each niche is a taza or painted clay image, or deity, protector, or teacher. These little clay images, also often in the Tibetan tradition, are also mixed with ashes, so they're relics in some ways. The multi-storied palace in the center is reminiscent of both an Indo-Tibetan reliquary and the exterior architecture of the building adjacent to this shrine panel. This is the place where it's located within the Forbidden City. As with the Qianlong tankas, several of these shrine panels are recorded to have been placed at various locations in the imperial palace. Here's another example from another place through the palace. So through this multimedia assemblage, the refuge field tankas pictorialized surface of vision is thus transformed into a reliquary, into the materialized, albeit enshrined presence of lineage and teachers and deities, where the painted palace and mountain paradise of Manjushri become the ultimate physical receptacle of the divine. So regardless whether these were used for supports visualization, painted and sculpted icons within Tibetan Buddhist traditions are similar to they are in the medieval Christian context, considered living images. Through a recurrent process of fabrication, consecration, and veneration, they become regarded as instantiations of the divine. The Tibetologist Yale Bentor's study on consecration images, which is in the Buddhist context, consecration is just like in many other, the process by which physical representations are made to become what they represent. Here you can show that what her study showed is that the insertion of relics is the primary means by which objects are then transformed from an inanimate to an animate one. So images are packed to the brim with objects from all varieties that are considered relics. They could include bodily relics, but most often these are relics of sacred text, mantras, clay images. That's just the one we saw in the shrine panel. And I suspect the same conceptual framework for ritual animation is likely true for all, if not all, many, if not all Buddhist traditions, such as this famous example from 10th century Japan that Professor Rambelli has written about, where images are outfitted with textile internal organs. In the case of two-dimensional tankas, and I hope I'll be done soon. In the case of two-dimensional tankas, mantras associated with deities are placed behind exact locations where the deities are depicted in order to animate the deity of the mandala. So the same thing, in other words, you have mantras. So I just quickly show you that this exhibit that Ruben a few years back, where they had everything displayed in so you can see both sides to see how this object is properly animated. I have one more page. Okay. All right. So I'll just quickly, I'll read the paragraph. Yale Benter's study on consecration also revealed that the consecration ritual of images in Tibetan Buddhism parallels the transformation that a practitioner undergoes in a tantric ritual. Just as consecration transformed the object from an inanimate to an animate one, visualization and other tantric practices transform the practitioner from an ordinary person into a Buddha. And just as those performing the consecration images must themselves be purified and transformed in the first place, the ritual transformation of an individual must also be depending on living images. It is in this way that the subject-object matter-material dualities are maintained for the purpose of their dissolution. Returning now to the Qing Tankas very quickly, I think a few things, we need to see the backside of these to know what's going on, but also that these images that we know, because we know that these images embodied an explicit ideological agenda, the crafting of an imperial persona, meant the possibility of ritual transformation would have been first and foremost as a concern for their makers. To affirm non-duality is to affirm the worldly and the material as inseparable from the spiritual and the immaterial. As unexpected as it must have been to see the Manchu emperor materialized through European Baroque realism at the center of a Tibetan Buddhist genealogical painting, it is important to remember that the visual world generated by the practitioners' imaginative capacities, which is a fundamental part of their training, would have been equally being unfathomable and subject to individual experience. So perhaps the Qing Tankas and shrine panels would only confound those who treat ritual and as stable and who treat Buddhist ontology as fixed. Thank you.
We have some time for Q&A. Yes, please.
Again, thank you both for marvelous presentations. Fabio, I have a question about, I thought that the account of the show was wonderful, but I'm wondering what it is that you think is sort of specifically culturally Japanese about that. What I'm thinking is that I know musicians, when they talk about their instruments, whether it's, a violin or a cello or a special piano or a special guitar, they say much the same things that the instruments do as become an extension of themselves and do take on a personality, a kind of animation. And I'm wondering also, even like race car drivers with their cars and things like that, whenever you have a material extension that is so intimately connected with an activity, the objects do take on a certain personality. But I'm wondering what is specifically, I think, culturally Japanese about what it is that you said about the show and what might be more general.
Thank you. This is a very good question. I tried to preempt that kind of question at the beginning when I said that, if we sit at the table, we end up talking about the same things. And I think so. I think I'm really grateful for your comment, because I think that a lot of this is really common. So you mentioned musicians, car racers, probably artisans also, in their tools. What is specifically Japanese about this? I think it's the entire, the metaphysical background and the ritual apparatus around, all the different layers of sacrality around the instrument that we cannot find, as far as I know, with any Western instrument today. Although I should also say that these things were, what I mentioned today, were mostly based on the past. I mean, a lot of this is gone today. So I wonder if in medieval Europe, for example, people could talk about musical instruments by mobilizing, the entire metaphysics of music and all of that. I normally see it done separately. So musicians are musicians and theoreticians of, like philosophers are philosophers. Here you can see it in perhaps the same person was writing about all of this. But this is
Well, I think a lot of the theoreticians of music in the period that I know, which would have been 16th and 17th century, were both practicing musicians and
They were also,
theoreticians. And there certainly was metaphysical background. I mean, you think, for example, of, the whole numerology and ratios and things like that, and the metaphysics that went with that. There was at least one
yeah.
metaphysics.
So that's another similarity, I guess. So really, the content of the metaphysics is different.
Yeah.
But even so, I mean, the show even today is tuned in the Pythagorean system, not in the Western system, and so that is another similarity, I guess, with modern or early modern Europe, I suppose.
There's a question here.
Yes, a question for Wen-shing. Thank you very much for your nice presentation. And in regard to the tankas, I'm wondering if you look at the meaning of the object and then also in the creation of the object, to what level do you think that the creator of the object has also put meaning into that? To be more specific to that, is if you would now, let's say, analyze it and then go through the object itself, where you may find on the drawings, something like that, do you think that is, well, if that carries any importance, that the creator?
Yeah. So who are the creators here, right? So for the particular tanka that I'm talking about, it's the Jesuit missionary on the one hand, right? So he was probably asked. So some person have theorized that even though it's very ironic that this missionary comes to paint the Tibetan tanka, probably the people have thought probably what he did was just to paint the head, and then it was handed over to the workshop, and it'd be done by the Tibetan monks. Now I'm imagining another scenario as I'm writing this paper, because it would have been so shocking to the Tibetan lamas to have to paint around this portrait. Maybe they painted it and handed it over to Castiglione. And now I think both ways is very interesting. How much would they have? What is the question of how would they have understood it or not, and how would they have processed it or not? Because those are, as far as we know, two kind of fairly distinct traditions. So on either end, it would have been this kind of confounding process, but maybe not. So I think if I'm trying to answer your question here, the agents are, there's also the emperor, who obviously had a hand in this, even he didn't paint it, and he commissioned it. So all these people, maybe aside from Castiglione, had an awareness of this kind of ritual framework in mind. If you were asking about in general, who are the makers of tankas? No, just these tankas, right? So that's, does that answer your question?
Yeah. It's just to what level that it would give an addition to the meaning,
right?
If you take it into consideration as to the diversity of the creation, like you said, from the Jesuit to.
I mean, I found it very unique in both of your papers. That both of your papers dealt with things in which, I'm sorry if I sound very 80s, the West kind of interferes. You have a Baroque Jesuit painter, right, interfering in an all-day tradition.
Or he's being interfered.
Or he's being interfered, right? So a dualist Jesuit painter is somehow doing something to an old age process. And you, on the other, Fabio, have, I don't know, somebody like Björk, but I'm joking, somebody a bit earlier than Björk that also break a whole circle of, I would not even call it appreciation, but understanding of the significance of the relationship between the player, the instrument, the sweat of the player, to the extent that, now we can, as you suggested, find modern day parallels, but I think that was maybe much stronger back in the day. So it's, in a way, our West, or us as scholars even, breaking into something, and in a way the sacredness of lack of dualism is is evident. Now, wondering in both of your papers, both of your views, do you think that this is, I mean, do we see actually interference? I mean, we see physical interference, but do we actually see that they never overcome their interference, or the interference is something that is very much of the moment?
I could say very, very sort of fairly confidently that there was no interference in the sense that let's just say it was not the agent, it was not him interfering in the sense that he was a court painter, so he was ordered to do this. He was ordered to do this, and precisely this Baroque realism, or this kind of subdued form of it, was being utilized as a truth-making technology in aid of this other truth-making enterprise. And so in some ways it's a very, I mean, it depends on what you're talking about, how you talk about it, yes. But I think the issue here is that this new form of veracity is being incorporated into this age-old form of veracity. And as far as Tianlong is concerned. Yeah.
Yes, in my case, the interference from the West, let's say, it's much later. It happens with the modernization of Japan around like 1860s, 1870s, when the Japanese decided to adopt all kinds of Western things, and including music. So that caused all kinds of problems for the imperial musicians, because they're questioned, your music, the foreigners don't like your music, it's noisy, it's dissonant, so you should change. And now, in fact, they do both. In fact, they play the traditional instruments of Gagaku, and they play Western chamber music. But so that caused all kind of rethinking about the tradition, how to preserve, how much of it should be preserved. So, Jen?
Yes, I have a question and a comment for Fabio, and wanted to say one of the great things about being at the BGC is that Fabio and I actually started our discussion on the C train this morning and found that we were doing similar research in terms of, I look at stringed instruments and what we call the anthropogenic deposition from the musicians, basically the deposition of the sweat from the musicians, and how that changes how stringed instruments sound over generations. And this is something that has a lot of dramatic tension in the West. When you talk to musicians, they take it as a given, and yet when you talk to conservators and scientists, sometimes they think of it as, oh, hocus pocus, there's no way that the history of the instrument is actually changing the sound of the instrument. And so we turn to science again to show that, yes, in fact, the sweat deposits on the instrument are very much present and going to be impacting the dynamics of the wood. And I wondered in Japan how this was viewed, the relationship between the musician and the instrument, if this is something that is simply taken as a given there.
It's an excellent question. In the sources that I've seen, it's not made explicit. So what I described about the practices, transferring your own bodily traces on the instrument, that is kind of oral. I mean, they tell you. There is an encyclopedia about music dated 1511, and I'm reading it, but I haven't found anything specific about that. But certainly, what they can tell you is that important instruments that were important for some reason, because they belong to important people, or because there were some legends associated to them and so forth, they're given a name and they're listed, and the record of those instruments remains over many centuries. So I guess that was this kind of importance attributed. I mean, the instrument became a vessel of something just because of that.
Aaron?
I have a question that builds on this, but also goes back to Ittai's, and that's really, it seems like in both of these cases, one of the interesting questions is not so much whether the individual objects are sacred or secular. In fact, they challenge that binary to begin with. But what interests me, again, going back to Ittai's question about cross-cultural moments of exchange, production, reception, is really, it's a refiguring of the question away from the kind of category to which the object belongs, and its embeddedness in practices of sacralization or secularization over time or at any one particular moments of time, and to sort of move into a more processual kind of away from a binary and towards a kind of embeddedness in certain kinds of motivated practices.
Joyce?
So I have just a kind of slightly strange question, which has to do with the difference between what we say a category of objects is supposed to be doing versus, through the kind of history that you've unpacked about the production of the image itself, the ways in which this seemingly sacred object is deployed for political ends, and in ways that mirror what's going on in Baroque painting period, or really any sort of painting, I think. And so I guess the question for me has to do with the ways in which something like seeing as a public enterprise and a kind of political enterprise versus seeing as a spiritual enterprise are being distinguished or mutually kind of reinforced at the moment that you're talking about.
Question for me, yes. Yeah, so no, thank you. I think it is part of what I'm trying to untangle your question, because so much of, in terms of that binary of the secular and the spiritual, the political, or the religious really doesn't hold at the moment that I'm talking about. In fact, we are looking at, the very idea of Chakravartin that I alluded to in the wheel turning is this ideal of a wheel-turning ruler who is a worldly ruler. And I use the word worldly rather than political because I think that category of political doesn't exist with the context of talking, but worldly, like of this world, which is the rulers of this world. The way that the worldly ruler doing his worldly things is supposed to somehow aid the flourishing of the dharma, of the dharmic, which is there is the spiritual world. So very much this is the image is the vehicle. All rituals were vehicles. They were vehicles, just as they were vehicles to enlightenment, they were also vehicles for aiding worldly change. And so those two things, and even the whole, if you take a step back and think about what is visualization, it's exactly creating a world, and there's nothing more worldly than creating a world to dispel illusions of this world. So that very process and the very materials that come with that process, or the processes themselves, are grounded in the knowledge and experience of this world. And that's the basis of tantric practice in general. So of the 18th century and in general, I would say in general, the tantric esoteric path is that. So I don't know, yeah.
Peter.
I'm going to save time because I don't have a question. It's just an intervention, and that is struck in both of your talks by the way in which the category of prosthesis could be very useful as a way of thinking about all this, because it allows for creating a kind of highway back and forth between the material and the immaterial. I thought that was a great kind of a contribution both of you made. And then I thought to myself that actually André Leroi-Gourhan did just this 80 years ago when he talked about technology. Technology was invented by him as a term precisely as a way of overcoming the split between the human and the object. So the object is only really functioning when it's being mobilized by the human. And so I think this is another way in which we need to, there are resources available, that's what I want to say, for approaching this category and thinking about the interplay between the active and the passive in exciting ways.
There's many more questions. It's time for lunch and we're running late, so let's thank our two speakers.